well-known designers in the community. We have Ziptyze, Alex at Panc, right on the Bay, and right on Norbauer. So let's just start off with a little introduction from each of the people on the panel first.
Do you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah.
So I'm still Brian Norbauer. I mostly make aftermarket upgrade housings for Topro keyboards. At least that's what I've done up until this point. I've done some keycap things occasionally, but not particularly seriously. That's about the extent of all you need to know about me.
My name is Zach. I am Wyatt on the Bay. I, along with my partner George in the back, run Keycult. We make high-end custom cherry keyboards.
I'm Alex. How are you folks? I mostly design crazy, ridiculous keyboards that nobody wants to use, 40% staggered orthos and things like that. Did the Boardwalk, Menorca, Seaboard keyboards as well.
Matt, or Ziptyze, originally started out making 3D printed cases for 60s until you could get milled anodized aluminum ones for $50 in China. And now I've started making and designing different 40%s, like the slant first, just kind of like the plank that just
All right. So at the end, we will open it up to the audience as well if you guys have questions. I also tweeted saying you can tweet back to me if you want to ask that one question as well, but either works. So let's start with some of the questions that I prepared. So I've known Ryan the most from this panel on a personal level, and I know you recently visited Disneyland, right? Because one, I guess, for vacation purposes, but also to find inspiration. So I wanted to ask the panelists, what inspires you guys and where do you guys draw these inspirations from when you guys are working on design?
Let's go on and on about that. I'm wearing my Disneyland shirt right now. Yeah, so my interest in Disneyland actually grows out of something that is deeper for me in keyboard stuff, which is this general aesthetic that I frequently refer to as retrofuturism. Right? For whatever reason, ever since I was a kid, I've been very drawn to visions of the future from the past. Particularly like from the 1960s, like the sort of aesthetic of mid-century modernism, the idea that like in the future everything would be super sleek and awesome, right? And so like this also grew into more sort of beige, pastel, soft aesthetic from Star Trek: The Next Generation that I grew up on, and just like all of these ways of shaping things and sort of thinking about what technology will look like in the future and indicating how that like humans will interact with that visually. Like I just find that super cool. And Disneyland, was created by Disney, who had a similar preoccupation of like what human progress, like how human progress happens, what it looks like, and just kind of celebrating and encouraging that. So there are all these components of Disneyland that are very much infused with the like sort of avant-garde aesthetic of the 1960s of futurism, and that's like everything that I'm into in some way or another always ties back to that for me. And keyboards, of course, like as objects, are entirely about that idea of like, the computer as a thing connecting us to the rest of the world, and the promise of that being super exciting to me as a kid. Like that's like very conceptually linked to the idea of futurism.
That sounds awesome.
Good answer. That's it.
I feel I take a much different approach. I think I don't yet have a particular aesthetic or idea that I'm sort of working towards or building off of. Maybe I'll find one eventually, but currently don't have one. The two boards that I've designed so far are cleverly named the number 1 and the number 2. Both have a very extremely different aesthetic and come from different places. Both of them are actually largely based on what I've seen in various other keyboards. The number 2 especially is heavily inspired by the Happy Hacking Keyboard Pro HG, which is this unobtainable Topre variant that like 10 people who work at PFU have. And I wanted to have something similar, and so I had to make it. But I'm thinking more about if I want Keycult to be a sustainable long-term venture, how do I continue putting out things that are fresh and interesting? And so I guess I'm sort of constantly in search of inspiration, but not yet in sort of one particular place or one particular aesthetic.
I mean, when I was looking at developing smaller keyboards, I remember I saw a Quark that Jack had out, saw it on his website. I was like, this is amazing. I can't wait to have this. I had it in the shopping cart for a couple of weeks, was waiting, you know, as I'm sure we all have, and all of a sudden they were sold out. I was like, oh, are you kidding me? So what I eventually started to do was develop my own 40% designs and, you know, kept iterating until it was something that I felt was useful, but also kind of crazy. I didn't necessarily want it to be crazy useful. I mean, how useful can a 40% be? Hey, I love it. I've got all people in masses. So, but I love it, obviously, and I, you know, love if other people love it too. But for the most part, I want to make sure that it's a design that's interesting. It's, you know, it catches your eye, but at the same time, you can derive some use from it. When I started to work with 3 other different people. One of the main person being Shen's Mobile, who designed the boardwalk and the staggered, the ortholinear 60% keyboard that we ran a little while ago. His idea and the things that we wanted to help him do is to make sure that it was going to be useful, but at the same time accessible. We want to make sure that everybody could get a hold of it. It was going to be something that was available to everybody, and you know, we planned on doing multiple iterations in the future, changing the terminal design from USB Mini B to C, all the way around to things that everybody felt would be the most useful to them. So when we went from the ground up, we just wanted to make sure that it was, you know, useful, but also kind of out there.
I guess for me, you know, I'm coming at things less from an aesthetic perspective, but at least since I've been involved in this, I've been focusing more on just kind of coming up with some new layouts and, you know, not big changes, but things that I would want to use. You know, for me, I really like ortho. Not everybody likes ortho, which is kind of what led me to doing this land. Because I think, you know, the Panc is a very efficient and usable form factor if you get used to it, but there are just some people that they can't do ortho. And people like 40% keyboards, but you also can't always cover them very well with all the key sets that are out there. And you know, you just end up with something, you know, you have the 0 for a space or something like that, but there are a pretty decent amount of Panc kits out there. So I just, you know, shift it a little bit. You know, just a simple little thing, and hopefully it gets some people who couldn't do straight ortho into feeling a little bit more comfortable, and also be able to cover all the keys with what they actually are. And then, you know, with my newer board that I'm working on now, which is the Sexy Back, I just, you know, one of my biggest things with orthos in general was, for some reason, I always just wanted that arrow cluster still. And I think it looks nice. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's kind of like what's the 660C, or what's the one that has kind of the arrow cluster? Yeah, 660C. So, you know, it has like a arrow cluster off to the side and blockers, so it's HHKB-ish. And that also brings a little bit more of an aesthetic quality to the 40% form factor, you know, because while Pancs and their clones are very popular, I mean, you're stuck with a brick, you know, and you don't get that kind of appeal on them. And I mean, obviously they're supposed to be small that you get from something like a TKL, but you know, sometimes people just want a little bit more surface there. And you know, so ultimately I'm kind of going off of what I want, and I hope other people do too.
Thank you. Do you guys feel like you guys oftentimes find inspiration when you guys are least expecting or looking for it, or when you guys are actively trying to be inspired for your next project?
I'm constantly just looking at things and taking pictures of things everywhere I go. I mean, just today, actually, upstairs, I stayed in the hotel, and I noticed that all of the fittings in the bathroom are brass, but they haven't been lacquered like brass usually is, so they've intentionally allowed them to oxidize. I'm very interested now in actually starting to make keyboards in like essentially an unfinished but maintainable finish, because nobody seems to do that very much. Like everywhere I go, I'm always looking at stuff and thinking, you know what, this could be a keyboard thing. I don't know. It's an obsession for me.
Yeah, I feel pretty much the same way. I mean, I'm all, out shopping with the kids and I see a color that I think is super cool and I'm like, that could be a keyboard thing. That's exactly right. I mean, I do a lot of refinishing of keyboards and people get dings and dents and scrapes and things like that in their anodizing or whatever. And so what I do is I have, in-house I have a media blasting setup and then I powder coat in the house and all things like that. So when I see a color that I think is super cool, like there was a yellow on like the Heavy 6, am I wrong?
Yes.
Right?
Texture good.
Amazing. Fantastic color right there. I mean, you would see that. I don't even know where you would see that, and you would really think that would look amazing on a keyboard. So
that came from a Ferrari car. I saw. It was a Ferrari car that was exactly that color, and then it had red brake calipers, and so I made the logo on the back have the same red.
There you go. Right. So you think about an accent like that, and what was it the exclusive EV6, EV2 or something like that? It had it was a 60%, I believe, and it had the band around the center that wasn't for LED diffusers. It was actually brass, where you could get a different color to actually contrast with the case color. And so you would see a lot of monochrome, so you would have a white case, black band, black case, white band. There. So I think that is really amazing. I really enjoy, combining, kind of things in that fashion.
Okay, Ryan kind of touched upon my next question too. So we oftentimes see in other products, like we'll see appliances that are supposed to blend in with your furniture or the likes. If you wish to see more kind of inspiration like that within keyboards, like is there a design trend you wish to see? Maybe, let's say, I wish keyboards look a little bit more car inspired moving forward, anything like that.
I don't really like design trends, generally speaking, but
How many fins on my keyboards?
yeah. I think there are too many trends in the keyboard design world as it is, right? It's like everyone is sort of acknowledging what other people are doing, maybe. Not acknowledging is maybe not the word. Copying is the word.
Heavily influencing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, this is not a moral question. I just think, bringing other aesthetics into it that are like a little bit less gamery is always desirable.
Right. I mean, for the most part, it's a rectangle, unless you start getting crazy with an L or something like that. Now, exactly, and then you want to elaborate.
It's pretty limited. A keyboard is a funny size and shaped object. Let's just acknowledge that. I think about this all the time. It's hard to photograph really well, and it's hard to think about how to represent it in visual form. I've been working on some illustrations that I want to just represent my brand in some way, and it's really hard to think about a way to represent a keyboard. And I don't know how to describe it, but it's just like a funny shaped object. There aren't many things in life that are kind of have the same proportions of a keyboard that you kind of nod to, other than maybe skateboards.
Everything's board shaped.
Yeah. That was a random thought.
I think, one of the most important things, not so much to move everything in one direction, but any particular designer really just kind of goes with what they're passionate about. Because realistically, there are so many different kind of design aesthetics. You want retrofuturism, you want muted, you want, hard angles. Everybody has a different idea. Back whenever I used to make cases and I would show people, everybody would be like, man, I wish that wall could be thicker. Or I want a bevel and not a bezel, or I want that rounded or hard angle, or I want that, But everybody kind of has a different idea of what they really like, and if we all just even kind of personally stick to what we would like to see out of it, then I think that's going to produce one of the best kind of products, rather than looking at what's popular and trying to incorporate that into our own designs. You're just not going to get that same heart in it.
You're making something for yourself.
Yeah,
trying
exactly.
to guess what other people want.
Because if you make something for yourself, people can see the love and the heart in that, in a way that you don't if you're just trying to look at what's out there and take what's popular and put it in your own stuff.
I think even among the four of us, we obviously care about very different things, right? I'm visual aesthetics are the primary preoccupation for me, and I have to kind of learn about the other properties and things that other people care about. I can barely hear acoustic differences that other people claim to hear, or tactile differences and stuff like that. Some people care about layout, some people care about sort of other form factor issues. I think it's interesting to see that people definitely gravitate to certain aspects of the design. Maybe we should all get together and fuse something that's absolutely
Keyboard cult slang.
All right, next question. So this is something that I noticed recently. I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect between keyboards and key sets right now. When you look at interest checks for key sets, I feel like a lot of the recent ones are all about selling the emotions and evoking your pathos. Whereas if you look at interest checks or even product pages for keyboards, it's just mostly here's the proto, here's what it looks like, and the hardcore specs, whatever aluminum series you're using, degree angle, all that kind of stuff. Why do you guys, do you guys feel that this is the case, and why do we have this kind of difference?
I think that I agree with you and think that the two designers who come to mind as sort of breaking that mold is Ryan and then Rama Works, who I think both put a lot of effort into selling the sort of idea behind the board instead of just here's the thing itself. I think we largely just try to I think that Keycult does not really do that. We sort of just put up specifications and try to take nice pictures so that people understand what they're getting and let people decide. But that's maybe more because right now we're not making that many boards. We have more people to buy them than we have them to sell, and so we'd rather move on to making more instead of spending a lot of time on selling. We also are doing limited runs instead of open group buys.
I mean, when we're talking about emotion and the way that you're trying to promote a key set, take us, right? I think from that, I mean, what you're seeing, you're going to be touching it, you're going to be feeling it. It's supposed to evoke a certain emotion out of you. I'd love if my keyboard would evoke an emotion aside from repulsion, but I don't. It's rare that we're talking about keyboards are a strange shape. It's hard to photograph them. I take a lot of pictures outside. We talked about this before. When you're using the keyboard outside, in a beautiful natural light. I mean, it's extremely rare. So when I'm trying to tell people about a keyboard or a case that I'm going to be making, I do my best to answer as many questions as possible. So if somebody comes in and says, hey, why don't you do this? I'm like, well, that's an awesome idea. Here's why I did what I did. And let's talk about, I'm happy to explore a conversation about why I didn't do what you did, or maybe a way we can incorporate what you did so that it's still, what I did, I guess is a terrible way to put it. But I'm perfectly happy with a collaborative process because, I don't think that anything is perfect. I guess is a good way to put it. So if you can find a good way to use what I'm trying to provide to you, I'm happy to figure out a way to do that. Changing around, like I said, terminals, like everybody is changing to USB-C. Well, maybe not everybody, but the point is that USB-C is a super popular terminal now. So I like Mini. I think it's way more substantial than C, and I know a lot of people still have C cables and things, have Mini B cables and things like that, but that's the trend. No, there you go. Switching to C.
No, switching back to Mini.
Staying big. But C is a big deal. People seem to like it a lot, and I'm happy to incorporate that. I'm not going to dismiss it out of 10 because I think I would love it if we stayed on B, along with Ryan, I guess.
It doesn't make any sense for keyboards. Why it should be a hard requirement that a keyboard should be USB-C? Is it the idea that just someday, far in the future, we will only have USB-C connectors?
People like that idea.
It's not going to be. It'll be 30 years. Computers will still have Type A sockets on them. I'm sure.
I still want cereal.
Yeah.
Nice big ribbon cable.
There's no rationale for it beyond that. And in order to actually have proper C functionality, you have to build a hub into your PCB, right? Otherwise, it's just like it's literally a socket form factor, and not necessarily a good one. As you say, Mini is more robust. I feel like that it actually stays in it better. Sorry, I could go on a long rant.
Right. So, but if you come in to me and you say, hey, you're coming into the because with Ryan, you're doing a lot of aftermarket.
Sure.
Right? So if folks wanted to design the PCB to have a C terminal, you'd probably be like, well, I've designed it this way. I don't know if you can get if you can get your C cable in there. by all means, figure it out. You want to measure it up, knock yourself out. But this is the way I designed it. Since I'm designing it from the ground up, like what I'm doing, like for instance, the Menorca, the 40%. I like mini B a lot, but a lot of people wanted the C. Having to investigate it, we went ahead and incorporated that. I don't like hot swap. I'm not really a huge fan of that as a solution. Overwhelming majority of people want that as a solution with their
Vocal majority.
the vocal majority. Who knows what I'm talking about, right? We haven't done a poll, not a straw poll yet. But they want it. I'm not going to fight the tide on that.
And I was going to say, at least as far as the difference between kind of the way you're selling those, you also kind of need to look at what board you are selling. If you are coming out with another TKL and everybody already has 5 of them, then you do kind of have to sell it like a key set, because if you are making another TKL, if you're making another 60, another 65, you are selling something that somebody already has, but you want these curves and you want this design and this is how it's going to be lit and all that. And you are selling that in the same way as you're selling your key set that somebody might already have 5, 10, or 20 of. If you come up with some sort of a new form factor, on the other hand, 65 with left numpad and a cluster off to the right and this and that, then you're selling that experience. You've got to sell like, this is why I think you should use this layout. This is what's good against this board. If you go crazy, you do actually put a hub in it, or an SD reader, whatever you want in there. Like you're selling that functionality. So I think it's kind of a functionality versus aesthetic there, and that's why key sets can be different than some boards, but some boards are sold much more like key sets, where they're a very established form factor.
Key sets have relatively normalized utility, with minor exceptions around exactly what keys are included in what kit. Ultimately, the utility you're getting from any given key set without being told exactly what that is. Whereas with a keyboard, a lot of it is about communicating like all of the different aspects of this keyboard so that you can understand, does this fit my personal need?
I'm exclusively interested in the evocation of emotions, because I think like a lot of these things in no way come down to need at all, right?
So perceived need, maybe.
Yeah, that was kind of brought up in my Discord server. Your 80-set interest check.
Right.
Regardless of whether it has the Norbauer brand name to it or not, regardless of whether the key set turns out nice, or at least the arrangement of it, the colors you chose, as long as it's not like extremely bad. Like I feel like that set would sell alone just based on the emotions you hold with your interest check.
Right, but that's like, it's the only reason I'm interested in doing any of this stuff, is to be able to like, through some really indirect way, through milled aluminum, connect with people emotionally, right? And like have some kind of shared aesthetic experience. And it's why I'm probably going to get into Cherry MX keyboards next year, because they allow so much more flexibility in terms of like designing a housing and a key set and having those match together. I would love to be able to, at some point, have somebody go on my site and be able to buy a keyboard that they could plug in and have it actually have like a uniform.
Get out of here! Like a keyboard you could just use.
Isn't that nuts?
Norbauer leaves Topra into MX territory.
People always see pictures of stuff I'm doing and they're like, "Can I buy that?" I'm like, "Well, sure. If you don't mind getting this out of like long back-ordered keyboard from Japan, and you don't mind waiting 6 months for an interest check and then spending an hour disassembling the board," and like, many people are like, "You know what? It's really cool, but I think I'm okay." I'd love to be able to just say, "Yeah, just call my site and order this thing. Isn't it cool?"
You gotta go and get that TNG console.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, I feel that I do agree. 100% not to cut anybody off. I like that too. I mean, when I think about usability, I think about people actually utilizing the actual, the piece of hardware that they're getting, and through that, right, they're deriving benefit. I think that's why we're all here. We're all here, right? I love to shake hands. I like making eye contact. I want to meet the people that are actually utilizing this stuff, and I'd love to hear what they think about it, because it would be crazy if I were some mad scientist in a tower. You're right, that never came out, and I would just throwing stuff out into the world that everybody loved. I mean,
Clack.
What's that?
So clack.
Black would be in the stream right now.
Who said that?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, doing this stuff is all too hard and expensive and laborious, and there's like not enough market for it to do it if you weren't doing it for those things,
Yes.
right? Like, even if it's not visual aesthetics, like each of us has these things that we obviously care deeply about, and making these things for someone else who also shares that extremely obscure, weird interest is something just like deeply satisfying and a way of connecting with people. So like, there are other ways of creating emotional responses other than just like creating a visual aesthetic brand. Like, if you guys make a layout that you and 5 other people want, but you really like you 5 guys really want that layout, that's like in many ways a more magical thing, right?
Okay, so next question. So content creators oftentimes will choose to not look at other content that is currently available for fear of it, tainting your review of a product or the likes. Does that also apply for designers? Do you guys, how do you guys balance viewing other people's work, and how do you guys also balance that with, like, let's say, competitive analysis or something? And are you guys afraid at all of crossing that borderline between something being an inspiration or something leading to becoming a clone?
I have a very like arm's length relationship with the keyboard community, mostly because I find it extremely overwhelming, like to comprehend all of the conversations that are going on at any time in a given day, and like it all has its own sort of meme-driven vernacular that I'm totally uninitiated.
Old men here.
Yeah, and also there is just like totally what you said. It's just like I just want to like do my own thing and not necessarily have like be overly influenced by what other people seem to want. Because then that's like the surest way to be very quickly commodified, right? And so I just want to do like weird stuff. But occasionally, especially as I'm learning about how to make a really good MX board, like there's a lot of community-based knowledge that's out there that I'm trying to like dig up and figure out how to find that information. So I do have to sort of dip into it occasionally, but mostly what I do is I just lean on those of you who are like my ambassadors to the keyboard world, like Olivia, Nathan, my friend Preston. They were like, they can jump into the foray of Discord, so I don't have to. I don't know if that's an answer to your question exactly, but
Yeah. I mean, I don't really ever. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to look at every single keyboard that exists. I don't really ever think it'll impact what I would ever create. I mean, or anything like that. I mean, I think it's important to look at things when you're making it maybe from the ground up. I don't know how Zip would feel about that, but just so you're making sure you're not tripping over anybody else's toes or making any mistakes, that you've encountered, because it is super magical to make something that only 5, you and your 5 friends also want to use. Absolutely. But sometimes you won't be able to make that thing because only you and your 5 friends want to use it. The world's getting smaller, so that's less and less likely, fortunately, but at the same time, in my philosophy, it sounds ridiculous, I want people to use it. I want as many people to use it as possible, and I don't ever want anybody to have a barrier to have to use it, whether it's me making something that's copying something else or making a mistake that's that has been solved before. So I will look at
And I think for me, my biggest motivation there is just trying to make sure that somehow somebody else didn't do the exact same thing as me already. And because I'm looking for what hasn't been done yet. I was never really interested in just making another 60% PCB, and some people might, or like Creamy, who's redoing, if anybody needs it, for an OTD Mini, a new PCB for that, like that has more of a case. But yeah, because I think that's big, and that's across the board, not just with the keyboards itself, but key sets, obviously, artisans, big faux pas doing something that is too close to somebody else in this community. So if I'm not doing that, then I'm okay, and hopefully I don't have to look too hard for that, or at least maybe somebody just calls me out and I'm like, oh, okay, somebody did that 5 years ago and it failed. And I'm like, okay.
I mean, there's a lot more sharing, I think. Maybe I've got blinders on, but when I think about the Alice and then I think about, I can't even pronounce the names, like the the lubricant there, lubricant, whatever it is. And then there's the Prime E, which is the 40% that's similar to the Alice. So, layout, you see a lot of things like that. Nobody's howling, right, about how that design was stolen or how this person shouldn't be allowed to do this and that. I believe in the original post of all those ICs or GBs or whatever, they actually say, oh, I talked to so-and-so. They said, cool. So I went ahead and moved forward with it. So I like that aspect of it and how we're bringing everybody together. And if they did have a problem with it, they would say, no, you can't do that. Do that, and then you go ahead and innovate in a different direction.
Okay, so I think I do have more questions, but it's already past the halfway mark, so I'm going to start reading some questions. I got a tweet from Too Many Keys. What's the single most common misconception about the design process?
That it involves designing is most of what you do. It's like 1% of my time on anything I do related to keyboards is in my CAD software. That's like the easiest thing ever is designing the keyboard. Getting the damn thing made and getting it out to people is absolutely all that you do all the time. And it's not, sadly, the most fun part of the process, but it's just like, I had this experience when I learned how to sew things. Like I was really into bags for a while in industrial sewing, and I was shocked to learn that the tiniest fraction of what you do when sewing something is actually sewing. All of it is like the designing of the patterns, the cutting out of everything, the assembling, the clipping, just getting ready to sew is what all the process is, right? Same thing with design. Like you spend very little time designing. Unless you're like a designer at Apple or something and you have people to handle everything else, that's a different process. But like for anyone who's doing anything like what I think we're doing, you guys probably would recognize that it's mostly like figuring out how to get the thing physically made, right?
Yeah, I mean, making stuff is super hard.
Yeah, get right, producing, right?
Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
And it's the least fun.
There, right, exactly. The CAD part's the fun part. And
Designs
then
and
you get
ideas
to
are
argue
very
with.
easy to come up with.
Right, right.
I also think that that's maybe another thing is that it's sort of also the case in businesses, which is ideas are cheap and execution is what's important.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you see it all the time. I mean, there you can go through ICs and and Keycult threads and mechanical keyboard Reddit, subreddit threads all over the place and see where something may have been done better. Of course, we can, nobody is perfect. I think we can all agree to that. And then GBs can be done better, logistics can be handled more fluidly, and then designs can be made so they are more efficient, right? But I think everybody here is involved in the design and the production phases, right? So, yeah, I think, right, that's the hardest part is getting that into somebody's hands and they not wanting, to take a chunk out of you because, something's wrong.
And also, like you said earlier, just the idea that for most people in the community, this isn't the only thing that we do.
Right.
We're not sitting in an office filling orders, like waiting around all day waiting to get messages to troubleshoot stuff. I mean, we're coming home and maybe packing up a couple of things in between making dinner for the kids or something. But it's it is a hobby. We want to try to get things out as quickly as we can. And some other life takes precedence sometimes.
It does sometimes. And nobody's trying to say that, people's money's green is mine. So it's not like I'm trying to say, hey, you guys ain't gonna wait. Nobody would ever say that, right?
Communication,
right? Yeah, we can all agree. Communication very, very important. So what was the actual question?
Yeah.
Communication isn't,
We're all just waiting in front of a computer
Exactly.
screen, like waiting to
Right,
respond.
right. The email comes from the manufacturer. Maybe we can just hit the floor panel, pull up our screen, and we're ready to roll.
And they're shipped out the day after we get it.
Right, exactly.
You gotta sort all that stuff.
Sort of. Got it.
Okay, the next question comes from Dixie. Do your designs from beginning to end up like your deliberate choices you made from the beginning, or do your designs evolve from your first vision to become something you never imagined?
Kind of a bit of a combination of both, although I would say that in the case of the number 2, for instance, I had this idea of I wanted something that was shared an aesthetic with the Keycult Keyboard Pro HG, and that included this like screwless bottom So I had this idea that like I wanted to have no screws externally in the case so that we could have this like nice, clean, seamless piece of stainless steel on the bottom, that would be really cool. And then I just had to spend a really long time figuring out how to actually implement that in a way that also didn't feel like it compromised the construction of the case. So I guess that was an example of starting with a vision and then sort of working through it quite a lot. In contrast, for the number one, I felt like I did have this vision at the beginning, and it felt pretty obvious as I was building it. For sort of everything just kind of came together in a really obvious way to me as I was designing it.
Yeah, I mean, my stuff definitely progresses from the beginning. So, I don't think anything that I designed, when we were working with Brian with Shen's Mobile, Shen's Mobile was a genius, it's a mad genius, when he was designing the boardwalk. I mean, I don't think what we started with is what we ended with. I mean, it went through, must have been 100 iterations. We've gone through daughter boards, different terminals, different layouts, different socket types, different, switch support, so on and so forth. So, I don't think anything. What kind of, would be like magic bullet. We went right from, what I saw in my eye brain, right to what was on my desk. So, it definitely takes a long time. So I thought about that.
Yeah, because you can start out with one idea. One of the biggest things for me, if you want to have multiple layouts on a keyboard, that's great. And then you stick all the footprints on there in the PCB editor, and you find you can't do a couple of them. Because they overlap in a way that it just won't let you, and sometimes you have to kind of forget some of those. But I think that's one of the biggest things. You try to incorporate everything in your original dream.
Yes.
But sometimes you have to pick and choose a little bit.
You do, right.
Not too much.
Right. Some things end up on the floor,
Yeah.
and you can incorporate, other things. Like I don't want to. So do you do the PCB, right?
No, I work with someone else.
Okay, but they design a PCB,
Yeah.
right? Absolutely. So you probably heard a lot of things like, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? And then once you start incorporating different layouts for this PCB, it won't hold together anymore. There's no silicone there. I forget what it's made out of. The point is that there's nothing there for it to hold together. You just got Swiss cheese, and you hear that, sometimes. So you definitely have to do.
Or you end up with a plate that just looks like the flag.
Right.
Straight through it.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, I only got 2 okay-ish questions for some Claudius members, so yeah.
I guess going back to designs, how do you know when to stop iterating on your design? Like an example is I was doing a canvas painting and I just kept kind of adding shit to it, and it never I was afraid to overdo it. So when do you kind of know when to stop, or how do you stop yourself from keeping on adding or taking off or doing something like that?
I don't know.
I think for me, it helps to set kind of some specific goals, because like you're getting at, you can be working on that and just think about all the extra things that you can do. But I know with the sexy back, one of my biggest things, and I don't know how much people get this reference, I wanted to make that whole PCB with no vias. And I'm like, if I can get this all routed up with no vias, then I'll be happy. So I get to that end, and it took 7 times as long as it probably should have, especially if I use an auto router. But then I got it done. And I'm like, all right, I've got this happy. Let me get some prototypes for it. But otherwise, I feel like it'd be very difficult if you don't just set the specific, all right, I've done this, so that means I'm going to order prototypes now.
Right.
Because you do always want to tweak.
I think it depends a lot on how clear your vision is before you get started. So if you have a clear vision, then you can set pretty clear goals, and then you can measure when you've achieved them. Whereas if you are sort of designing in search of a vision, then it's going to be a lot harder to know where the stopping point is. You're sort of constructing everything as you go.
Yeah.
You don't want an ad hoc design philosophy, right? That's basically what you're saying. You want to make sure that you have
Well,
a beginning and an end.
you might end up with something really great, for sure. I don't
mean
think
no improvisation, but I mean you have.
Yeah, well, but it's more just to answer the question of when you know when to stop. And I think it's sometimes you just have some gut feeling. Sometimes you have like, I want to be able to accomplish these things. To Ziptyze example.
Yeah.
And then you can say, well, I've accomplished these things and I'm happy with everything else, so I'm done designing. But it can be harder if you have a less clear idea of what you're trying to accomplish. If you're just trying to create something that kind of like feels good enough to release,
Yeah.
then you don't know. It's gonna be harder to know when to stop.
There's always V2.
Right, there's always VX. Yeah.
Next question.
What are your thoughts on more outlandish keyboard designs, like with the Keyblade and the Clueboard 2X 1800?
I mean, I like everything that's wild. I mean, that Keyblade is super dope.
Don't kink shame.
Right, exactly. Everybody's got something. I mean, everybody loves a Keycult. I can't hear, everybody loves it. So,
But we probably make the most standard keyboards of anyone here.
everybody wants one. It's fantastic. So, I mean, I don't know how exactly you would kind of describe, a left field layout. Because I mean, I'm sure yours are.
We did a 60%.
Watch out.
Yeah, I mean, that just gets rid of the arrow keys. It's crazy.
Get this guy's drink.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
I think it's really awesome. We have such an interesting strategy designers. But since we have such an interesting strategy, I want to know where you guys want to see more development and more kind of change in this landscape, like more on the aesthetic side, more on the layout side, more on the implementation of PCD. Where is it that you guys would either find it most interesting or most impactful for the community development?
I want more science, like more actual understanding of why decisions are being made, why you're adding certain features to your board. And I guess I'm coming from the perspective of someone designing relatively standard keyboards that are kind of standard multi-part keyboards, and we're experimenting with different elements that differentiate our keyboards from others, like the inclusion of vibration damping foam inside of the case that clamps the plate. There's other things that a lot of people add to similar keyboards, where you have these sort of relief cuts in the plate, either to change acoustics or to potentially introduce flex. I have been trying to avoid we talked about this earlier, doing things just because other people are doing them when I don't really understand what change this is going to have. So I'd love to see just more understanding. Why are these things actually better? What effect do they really have on the board?
They love that USB terminal. USB-C, they want it. Exactly.
We're
Who
using
knows
it.
why, right?
I have a sort of broader ambition for what I think could be a positive change for the community, which is it is also how I'm thinking about. First of all, I'm trying to figure out personally whether I want to keep doing this, because it's a huge pain in the ass, but it's also extremely satisfying. And so an important part of that is figuring out, could I possibly build an actual sustainable business making keyboards? And I have no satisfactory answer to that question at this point in my life. But
Right?
well, yeah.
The answer is no.
And I don't necessarily, I don't proceed from the assumption that I want the answer to that necessarily to be yes, but I think it could potentially be interesting in a couple of ways. I think the way that would probably happen is for one degree of separation from the crowd of people who are here into another group of people who would potentially be consumers of really nice keyboards, but who don't necessarily want to get so deeply into the technical weeds, right? And so it's like those people that I mentioned when I show them pictures on my Instagram or whatever, who are like, oh, that's really great, I would love to have a fancy keyboard. They're the same people I know who buy Teslas and spend thousands of dollars on watches. These people could create a market for nice keyboards, I'm sure of it. If we could figure out how to make approachable things for them, and then build a kind of culture of that as simply being a product that people buy.
Start sponsoring Twitch streamers.
That's right. We got to be more approachable. Ryan, you have to be more approachable. I mean, I feel like that's the biggest thing. Well, you say you need to make keyboards that are more approachable. Wouldn't it be better if we were approachable?
like less technically daunting.
But you don't want asphalt though.
What's that?
You don't want asphalt.
But I'm happy to put it in.
That customer doesn't want it either.
I don't worry.
They want a soldered board.
Right, they just want a board.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, what I want to see in the future, it speaks to the question, is more transparency. I like to see a lot of talking. When I'm doing ICs and group buy threats and things like that, I try to answer, put in a Q&A, just the fact that, questions that I had that I answered in my own head, so I can make sure everybody knows why I did something. And then I can answer every single question that comes in about what they want. I think that would be best.
Okay, we just got another tweet in from Typebeast. What are the challenges in manufacturing new designs? Are things like the Foundry a solution for new designers?
What's the Foundry?
Well, if you guys don't know what the Foundry is, hopefully I say this correctly, but basically Rama is offering a manufacturing service for designers who want to get their keyboards produced. So he is working with designers. It's currently, I believe you have to be invited to it, but there's a select set of designers they're working with. They provide the designs, and then Rama will handle the manufacturing, shipping, all that process.
Has that been done? Like, has the keyboard been released?
No, thermal will be the first
Thermal
one.
is going to be released as
I would
a
never ever want to
pilot
do that.
board,
That
but
sounds
it
exciting.
hasn't been live yet.
I've never heard of that. That sounds crazy. Sounds crazy. I mean, it's different than I don't know how many people are in here for the key set panel, but a designer comes to you, they have colors. There's 3 different people that maybe 4 at this point that make key sets. You know that they'll make them. Can you get those colors in there? Will they look good? That's the variables are low. When we're it is a rectangle. It's not very interesting, hard to photograph and all that. But like you said, 1% of the time that we're spending is the resizing and fusion.
Well, I think what Foundry is RamaWorks is a company that has built up a certain infrastructure for fulfillment. They also have very deep and solid relationships with manufacturers, which is, in my opinion, one of the hardest things, especially when you're trying to make really high-end cases. The community as a whole has extremely high standards for quality, and maybe not everyone understands that it's not my ability to explain to a manufacturer the quality I want that is the limiting thing. It's like everyone is saying, hey, we want everything to be perfect. That's not the way that manufacturing works. There's always a defect rate, and like your existing relationship with the manufacturer is going to affect how willing they are to work with you. So anyways, what Foundry is offering is RamaWorks essentially saying, we have already put in the time to develop these relationships and this infrastructure. So let's run some other designs so that we can leverage that.
I definitely was not trying to excuse my language, I'm not trying to shit on the idea. It sounds amazing, it sounds super daunting, and it scares me.
Well, yeah, but that's probably because I don't,
Rama is amazing.
We don't have the infrastructure
exactly.
that he has.
Right, absolutely. The supply chain is out of this world for sure.
Because PCBs are easy enough to get made and not worry about it too much. The cases where, people lost their life savings over even going to a fab that they've used before. So I definitely understand the appeal of that. That's scary. You get into something and you've got $50,000 on the table, and you look at what the Spectro and that was even a fab you worked with before.
That was crazy. Yeah.
And he gets ghosted, and that's scary.
It's terrifying.
Are there any other questions? We'll try to get new people first. No new questions?
I think there's a few of us that might want to hear this focus with these quickly, but what maybe a few things that make it, at least from my standpoint of view, I always see these designers they get to be case manufacturers. As an engineering student, there's places to get aluminum shaped any way you want everywhere. Why? Where are the biggest roadblocks? What is it that makes keyboards seem to be particularly nuanced and difficult to work with manufacturing aluminum? Just
whenever you talk about getting something made from an engineering standpoint, you know, aesthetics aren't necessarily a concern. I mean, you can go, like you said, to many places and get something machined to a certain spec, but are you going to get it finished the way that you want? And that's going to limit the number of fabs that you go to, because you might have a lot of options for somebody. You know, can you produce this piece within these tolerances, with this kind of design? You know, can you know, are you able to mill this out in these diameters or whatever? But then whenever it comes to whether or not, you know, then they can sandblast it or hand polish it or finish it or anodize, or then, you know, if that's going to be another fab on top of that, you know, that's what's kind of complicating things. Because these aren't something, you know, the keyboards aren't going into like an engine or something where it doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter if you see the machine marks on it. You know, like that's a big consideration, you know, one of the biggest considerations for what we're going to do.
Most machine shops aren't accustomed to making consumer products, period. It's just not, it's not what they do. They make parts for machines or parts for industrial, aerospace, medical applications. And so the idea that they could spend an hour machining, fully milling out a part,
Then have to throw it away.
And then have to throw it away because it has a little scratch on it. Like, you're never going to get a shop that's not used to selling consumer products to not give you an extremely hard time about that.
And the ones that want to sell consumer products are working with quantities dramatically higher than what we're offering.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think
We're mostly working with like prototyping shops, if anything.
absolutely. Yeah, and anodizing is, I think, honestly, a terrible process for consumer products. It's great if you're a company like Apple and you can fully control the process and you have your own facility, but it's just not a process that was really intended for high-grade consumer cosmetic finishes. It's intended to be a cheap process that like uniformly oxidizes aluminum parts and to be done with, right? So most of the vendors that you'll find who are doing anodizing are used to dealing with that kind of customer and not a customer like you. Also, the percentage of the cost, like especially like in China, you're getting maybe a large block milled out that's the part for your case. That's going to be, you know, $80 to $100, let's say. If you send it to the anodizer, the actual anodizing cost is like $1, right? So the amount that you can get them to care is about $1's worth of caring. But to you, the cost of parts that don't meet that bar of $1 worth of caring is throwing away the part sometimes, or having to put in place this whole downstream infrastructure to get parts that are junk and how to figure out how to reclaim them by getting them powder coated or re-anodized or whatever. This is why I say like 99% of what I do is not designing things, it's figuring out how to solve problems like this, where you're dealing primarily with companies that aren't accustomed to understanding the requirements, not of consumer products in general, but also like really this community has the expectations of essentially a luxury market, very, you know, absolute cosmetic perfection. And then there's like this sort of business cultural problem between China and the United States. Shops that are doing this type of work in the United States are used to dealing almost entirely with industrial customers. But the shops in China make a lot of consumer products, but it's what could be generously described as a low trust business environment. And so you have to put in place all these other processes to check all the ways that they will try to screw you to save a little bit of money, because they're primarily competing on price. So there's really no optimal place to go if you want to get really good, like high cosmetic machine parts made at low quantities. It's like, this is the story of the misery of my life.
And anecdotally, and you know, I ran a 60% because I was like, this is going to be easy. Everybody uses 60s. It's easy to do this and that. I went to a place. It was no joke, 45 minutes away from me. I drove there several times, shook hands with the guy, looked him in the eyeballs. We had a nice conversation about what I wanted. They threw what I ordered in a box. They just threw it in a box. They didn't wrap it up. There was no. I was like, guys, I'm talking about thousands of dollars here, and you threw this in a box for me to come pick up on your loading dock. Is that? I can't even. It makes me angry even just to think about it now. I'm like, I can't even believe it. And I met the guy. I can't. You know what I mean? So it's exactly right. The people that you're working with here, they just work with gears and, you know, levers, you know, pins and this and that. They're not actually used to getting something to a absolute perfection.
They also work with industries that are not very price sensitive, like aerospace and medical, right? And so the quotes I've gotten for parts.
$2,000.
Yeah, easily for like a quantity of 400 or something.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, you know, even if I really like the person, there's no way I can possibly make that work out. Nobody wants to buy that case. Right. So you're sort of at the mercy of all of these very limited capabilities that are at your disposal within a certain kind of price range and like.
One more comment that I just wanted to make. That's sort of a pet peeve of mine, and it's regarding anodizing. Anodizing issues are a very common defect that people like to bring up with cases, and a lot of people seem to be laboring under the assumption that you should just re-anodize things that are anodized poorly. And the problem is that harms the underlying material, and most anodizing defects are due to issues with the underlying aluminum. So you literally can't re-anodize most things. You actually have to throw it away. This is just something that kind of, I like see people say like, well, why didn't they just re-anodize it? It's, well, because you're going to get the same result. Actually, it's going to be worse the second time you do it because, yeah.
I'll second that for sure.
Yeah.
Well, for the sake of time, we do have to end it. It's 3:58. There is another panel happening in 2 minutes on artisans, so feel free to stay around if you guys want. But thank you for.
I'm going to stay for 1 moment.